This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Winchester Academy's final program in our Roots of Jazz series, as well as the final program of our Winter-Spring series. My name is Maggie Jones, and I am a trustee of Winchester Academy. I'm also the chair of the program committee, and I'm a member of the Roots of Jazz committee. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for coming tonight, and I know that many of you have been at some of the other events too from Roots of Jazz in the last weekend. I want you to know how much we appreciate that. And as we return to our normal programming in this room, it's kind of fun to be back together again and in a room where we can sit side by side with this number of people. So showing up is really important to us, as are your financial contributions, which we use as a sponsor for our programs, for our speakers. And we appreciate your help in stacking the chairs afterwards, gently stacking the chairs afterwards. And also spreading the word to all of your friends and family about what excellent programs Winchester Academy offers. Our summer series is going to begin on June 13th. It's not that far away. June 13th, when Allison Fleshman has been rescheduled to present Watching Paint Dry. It's more fascinating than it sounds. And that program was originally scheduled in 2020, and that was postponed. It was canceled, and then it was postponed until earlier this year as part of our winter series. And then we had to postpone it because of bad weather. So we're all looking forward to seeing her on June 13th. And also, another bonus, we will be also having our cookies and coffee starting again in our summer series. I'd like to ask you please to silence your phones or any other devices that you have so that we don't have any interruptions during the program. And also, tonight is your last opportunity to bid on the silent auction for the art piece over on the table that was created specifically for our Roots of Jazz programming. And the auction winner will be announced at the conclusion of tonight's program. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Bryce Fund. The Bryce Fund was established in memory of a special little boy who, during his short life, made clear the simple joys that make our connections with each other meaningful. The values of the Bryce Fund align with the members of Bryce's family who seek to support the communities they share. This gift is being made in memory of their father and grandfather, Earl Herbert, who inspired them to ask questions to provide us with insights to allow them to be better citizens. And Jan Herbert, is Jan here? Hello, Jan. Jan Herbert is here with us tonight to represent the family. Thank you. And now let me tell you about our speaker tonight. Kurt Dietrich is Professor Emeritus of Music at Ripon College. And tonight he's going to give us an overview of the important jazz artists from Wisconsin and the trends that have led them from the early days, the roots of jazz, up to the rich and complex jazz scene that is occurring right now in Wisconsin today. Dietrich is the author of a book called Wisconsin Riffs, Jazz Profiles from the Heartland. And copies of his book will be available for sale at the conclusion of tonight's program. So please help me to welcome Kurt Dietrich.
Thank you. Thank you. So, am I on? Can everyone hear me okay? Well, thanks for that introduction, and thanks also to people who have helped out today and before today. Especially Ann has been answering my questions back and forth by email for some time. And Nolan was here to help out this afternoon when we were having a number of issues that Julie had to come in at the last minute and help us with. Thanks, of course, to the sponsors, to Jan and everybody else associated with that. And I am just amazed at the extravaganza that is the Roots of Jazz series. It's a wonder anybody's still showing up. But I appreciate the fact that you are. Just a couple of things, sort of preliminary things. So I taught at Ripon College for 39 years, and PowerPoint became a thing, but I hardly ever used it at school, and I never put words in it, because once you do that, you've lost them. However, my students, and I think everybody likes pictures, right? So I'm going to show you pictures. With one or two exceptions, all the pictures you're going to see tonight are in the book. I'm sorry to say they're all black and white in the book, but that's okay. You can't complain when a music book has 110 pictures in it. I mean, that's phenomenal what the Wisconsin Historical Society Press did for me. So you're going to see some of those tonight. And since this book came out in 2018, I've had kind of a canned presentation when I do these talks. I've done at least a dozen of them, maybe more. But I always sort of, tailor it for wherever I am. And I'll talk about people from that area. I might talk about people from different eras. But because of the whole roots of jazz thing, I started thinking a little bit differently about this talk tonight. It might work, it might not. I'll tell you one thing that I think will work, even though if you go down to the Historical Society, they say, when you talk about your book, do this, don't do that. I do all the stuff they say don't do, which is mainly I talk about a whole lot of people instead of just one or two. But if I talk about 10 or 12 people tonight, 10 maybe, let's say, I interviewed well over 100 people for this book, and there are profiles about 100 people in the book. Unfortunately, a number of the ones you're going to see tonight and hear me talk briefly about are dead, and I didn't even, they were dead before I even started working on the book in the early 2000s. But in any case, what I'm going to tell you is just a sliver of a big fat book and a big fat and rich history. Again, a little talk about the roots of jazz thing. Let's see if I can get to this. So you can look at this for a while and think, I'd love to have that. The thing that I started thinking about, and I taught jazz history. That was one of the areas I was in at Ripon College. I taught it for years and years. I have reviewed 75 books on jazz for various publications, so I've read a whole lot. I go to the conferences and we talk about it. And there's some things about the roots that are pretty well agreed upon. There's the rhythmic component from Africa, and I know Ryan Korb, my friend, was here talking about that. And, blues is always a big piece of it, and there's this and that. But I would like to suggest that those things that everybody thinks this is it, it's not as simple as that. And especially the way jazz developed early on, and especially in, let's say, the upper Midwest, which is to say Wisconsin, as opposed to New Orleans or Chicago even, although a whole lot of people from New Orleans came to Chicago, and that really colored what happened with early jazz there, or New York. It's just different. And so, if you were to go certain places and talk about roots of jazz, you're not going to talk about Eddie Hansen. Oh, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Now, again, ragtime was a piece of that, but if the I want to be careful how I say this. Certain people who have a very established idea about what early jazz was and where it came from, if they're going to talk about ragtime, okay, Scott Joplin's okay, but Eddie Hansen, no. Sorry. No. So anyway, so that it got me thinking about some things, and I'll touch on some of those as we go. I will say that this book, which is big, and so if you want to buy a copy, be sure you can lift it before you take it. No, I mean it's a reasonable sized book, but it's a substantial book, about 500 pages. The first 3 chapters in the book are about three guys. You know, first chapter on this person, next chapter on that person, and so forth. And then from there, I start breaking it down into eras and instruments and styles and so forth, so that by the end of the book, you get through over 100 people. Let's hope this works, right? Oh, we did. We already found it. So I know you all can tell who this is. Which one are you talking about anyway? Well, I'm talking about the guy in the middle when he was, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. And that was Roland Bernard, or Bunny Berrigan. And Bunny Berrigan was a big star in jazz in the swing era. He was born in 1908 in Hilbert. I bet some of you know where Hilbert is. But he grew up in Fox Lake, which still is sort of, but at that time was a big resort town. You know, and a lot of people from Chicago came up to Fox Lake. So there were some things happening there. And Bunny learned to play and he played in a family group. He played in these other bands that were around then. But, you know, if we heard those bands now, again, a lot of people would say, that's a jazz band? But they were playing jazzy music, and it was part of what jazz was back then, in the 20s I'm talking about now, when he was playing as a teenager. He finally caused so much trouble at home, I'm sure he practiced too much for one thing, that his parents, and he wasn't doing his schoolwork, his parents said, why don't you go to Madison, the big city, and live with your uncle? Well, that was great, except the uncle was a musician, and he didn't care if Bunny went to school either. So he got to Madison, and he started playing. He played in the theaters down there, of course. You know, some of those theaters are still around. He played on campus at dances and so forth. And eventually, it's happened in those days because so many groups were touring the country that somebody heard him, said, will you come play in my band? And one of them was a New York band. And he said yes, and he went to New York. And it wasn't long before Bunny Berrigan was a star. He was a great, great trumpet player. And here he is in Tommy Dorsey's band. There's Tommy over on the bottom right standing there. And Bunny is the tall, good-looking trumpet player on the left as you are looking at the band. And with Tommy Dorsey and also with Benny Goodman's band, Bunny Berrigan recorded some of the most famous jazz solos of the 1930s. And like other jazz musicians who were working for other people, I'll just give you one example that probably a bunch of you have heard of. Gene Krupa in Benny Goodman's band, somebody said, you know, you're so great, you should have your own band. And they were probably saying, and I'll be your manager and we can make money together. And so Bunny started his own band. He was a good-looking guy, young, and people liked him. He was a terrible band leader because everybody liked him. He liked to hang out with the guys. He had no business sense. And he really got involved with, forgive me for saying it this way, but I think we're all sort of Wisconsinites, I can say this. He got Wisconsin disease. He was an alcoholic. And that's a terrible thing to be when you're traveling around the country with a band, you know. And so he had one big hit with his band, but, you know, they just were living hand to mouth. They had to disband several times. His health got worse and worse. But when I came to Wisconsin as a college student in 1969, I know of at least 2 places that I went that this tune from 1937 was still on the jukeboxes in Wisconsin. One was a supper club in Medina, and one was a restaurant in downtown Appleton. And so this was Bunny's big hit. He sang it too, but I'm just going to play the end to show you what kind of trumpet player he was, and we'll hope this works. I think it will. It ought to work. We had sound before. Yeah, you can try doing that. See, it already went ahead, though. Yeah, you are, but you can try it, but you got to hit the play way over on the left there. You may have to take my word for it, but one thing we didn't check. We got sound from the internet, but not from here. I won't wait too long. I mean, I can keep talking, but yeah, but it was up before and it wasn't playing. I don't think it's going to work, Ann. Well, we'll see. You know, it's a lot better listening to music than listening to somebody talk about music. Anyway, she just clicked to the next person I was going to talk about. By the way, Bunny Berrigan died at age 33, and it was, you know, from alcoholism. His liver failed and all that. And here was this great, great trumpet player. The tune, by the way, is I Can't Get Started, and I bet some of you know that recording. So does anybody know who this is? Woody Herman. And Woody grew up in Milwaukee, and he was playing gigs early on, like when he was 12, 13 years old, and he would tour Wisconsin as the boy wonder. And he sang, and he danced, and he played saxophone mostly, played some clarinet also. And he played such exotic cities as Oshkosh and Fond du Lac, but he played a lot in Milwaukee. And Woody, who knows what would have happened to him had it not been for Sister Fabian Riley at Cathedral High School in Milwaukee. And she sort of kept him in school, and when the principal or headmaster or whatever said, we got to get this guy out of here, she said, no, he is worth saving. And I'm gonna take care of him, and she did, and it made a huge difference to Woody. By the time he was 20, he was out working with bands, and eventually got in the band of a guy named Isham Jones, who maybe none of you have ever heard of, but you know some of his songs, like It Had to Be You, he wrote, and other songs. And Isham Jones was making so much money from his songs, he said, well, I don't need to lead a band, it's too much work, I'm out of here. But the guys said, this is a really good band, we should not let it go. So they collectively led the band for a while. They put Woody out front as the front man, although he was only 23 years old at the time, one of the youngest guys in the band. And Woody eventually bought out everybody else's share, and it became the Woody Herman Band. And originally, and I'm going to try it, it's not going to work, but I'm going to try playing a tune here, but I can see we're not going to get it. With one horn, you can't play a big band arrangement. That's the trouble. But in any case, they had a hit in 1939 called Woodchopper's Ball. And it's kind of interesting about this. Back at that time, bands were essentially all white or all black. And Woody's band, of course, was all white, but they became known as the band that plays the blues. And their big hit was the dumbest, easiest tune. It's called Woodchopper's Ball. And it's one note. It goes da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, over and over, da-da-da-da-da, and then it's solo after solo. but there was something catchy about it, I guess because it's only one note. I can sing that song. Anyway, so Woody's career was sort of made at that point. In the 40s, he had phenomenal bands, some of the greatest bands in big band history, known originally as the First Herd, Woody Herman and his Herd, and then there was the Second Herd, and eventually there was the Third, and they gave up numbering them after a while, and it became the Thundering Herd and the something other herd. Here's Woody in 1946. He's backstage at Carnegie Hall. So this was how big he was, is that his band was asked to play at Carnegie Hall. And in fact, for this occasion, they commissioned Igor Stravinsky, arguably the greatest composer in the Western classical tradition of the 20th century, to write a piece for the band and Woody, Ebony Concerto. And Woody, he was worried. He figured, I got to practice. Thank you. And here's Woody with his band in the early 1980s. Probably none of you know where that is. It's in Disneyland. And so Woody kept a band going for 50 years. Longer than Count Basie, longer than Duke Ellington, longer than anybody. Woody Herman did this. And his bands were always really good. And you see there's a sound thing for this. I often play it because I heard records of this band in the 1960s when I was in high school, and I was just blown away. They still played Woodchopper's Ball every night, but the stuff they recorded was brand new and exciting and great playing. I'm sorry you can't hear it. So that's Woody. Now this looks like a jazz outfit. And the guy on the right, at that time was known, when this picture was taken, was known as Rhubarb Red. And yeah, he had a country thing, or what they called at that time in the 30s, hillbilly music. And there he was. He played for various radio stations, Chicago, St. Louis, and so forth. But his real name was Lester Polfus, and that was Les Paul. Now, a lot of people think Les Paul, he was a jazz musician. Les Paul was a really good jazz musician. And early on, after he got out of hillbilly music, he was playing jazz most of the time. When he wasn't making all these leaps in technology musically and figuring stuff out, like how to make an echo chamber for recording, how to overdub recordings, how to design a guitar that rock and rollers still today say, this is the guitar I have to play, the Les Paul Gibson model. So he was playing jazz. But then in the 50s, with his wife Mary Ford, they were among the best-selling artists of the 1950s. And she sang and played, and he played, and they did all these things, and they had one-hit record after another. Les was not the greatest husband, and so they broke up. He was just too driven, I could put it generously that way, and Mary couldn't take it. Anyway, but he kept going, and he became this revered figure. Here he is back in Waukesha. He was the Wizard of Waukesha, right? That's what he became known as, mostly for all his innovations and so forth. He's back here in Waukesha. I can't remember the year now, but for his mother's 100th birthday. It was in the 1980s sometime, or early 90s maybe. So Les had done all these things, but in the 90s he started playing jazz again every Monday night in a club in New York, and he did that until he died in 2006, I think it was. Every Monday night he played jazz again at the end of his career. And I could play you such a good example of his playing here with a phenomenal pianist in the 1940s. And I always say, okay, who is this? And if I got a real jazz crowd, they go, oh, it's Count Basie, Oscar Peterson, Nat King Cole, who was an amazing piano player before anybody knew he could sing at all. Anyway, so that's Les Paul. Now, I decided, because of this Roots of Jazz thing, to talk about a couple of guys that are in the book who I've never talked about before in one of these book talks. And they were both trumpet players. Neither were from Wisconsin, but they spent significant time in Wisconsin. And this is a guy who was known as Jabo Smith. His real name was Cladice. He grew up in South Carolina. And his mother couldn't take care of him. She sent him to the Jenkins Orphanage, which had a great music tradition. In fact, a lot of wonderful orphan musicians came into jazz out of there. Jabo tried to escape whenever he could, and he did escape, but they'd catch him. And he finally escaped for the last time when he was 16, and he made it to Philadelphia and then eventually to New York. And he took New York by storm. He was a great, great player. He drank too much. He partied too much. You know, he was 19 or something like that, and nobody was telling him what not to do. He made two famous recordings in the late 20s with the Duke Ellington Band. And Ellington asked him to join the band, and he said, I don't think so. I've got a pretty good gig with Charlie Johnson. So he didn't, which turned out to be a big mistake. But anyway, so then he became one of these musicians who went from band to band, town to town. He ended up in Chicago for a while. And then when he got in trouble in Chicago, he'd go to Milwaukee. And when he got in trouble in Milwaukee, he'd go back to Chicago. And so he had this existence for a while. But then he ended up living in Milwaukee for a long time. And for quite a bit of that time, he didn't play. But then he did start playing. And so now we're talking in the 40s and 50s. He had a day job to keep himself alive. And why did he stay in Milwaukee? Because he liked the town. Probably had a girlfriend or two. But he just liked the pace there. And he wasn't getting in trouble anymore. And so he stayed in Milwaukee for a long time. He had several comebacks in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So he'd go to New York for a couple of months and have all these concerts, and then he'd come back to Milwaukee. But back in the 20s, they said, this is the only guy who can hold a candle to Louis Armstrong on trumpet. But Jabo didn't quite live up to his possibilities, let's say, his potential. And here's Wild Bill Davidson. And he was born in Ohio, and he eventually came to Chicago and was making a name for himself there as a hot player. And this was back when New Orleans jazz was sort of being transformed in Chicago to what became called Chicago jazz. I was going to play you an example of this, and you could hear it because the example I was going to play was Wild Bill playing in 1981 at age 75. But the music still sounded like the 30s, and he was still really playing by then. You know why they called him Wild Bill? You can imagine. By the way, rumor has it that this picture that I got from a big jazz fan down in Milwaukee, obviously taken later, much later in Bill Davidson's life, was taken by Lord Snowden. Remember Princess Margaret's husband? And he was quite the photographer, and he probably took that picture. No one has called me on it yet in the book. I said that it might have been him. During the time that he was in Milwaukee, and I could tell you more stories, but I'll never get done if I don't keep going here. During this time, Davidson lived up to one of the titles that had been given him, the world's hottest trumpeter. He also lived up to his nickname, Wild Bill, due to his insatiable appetite for alcohol and women. One thing that happened when he was in in Milwaukee still, his personal life was in upheaval much of this time. He went home to his native Ohio briefly. His wife had a miscarriage. While in Milwaukee, Davidson met the woman who would become his second wife in 1943, Diane Lee, whose real name was Lorraine Hanson, a singer from Wisconsin who was billed as the blonde bombshell of popular song, and had become the new vocalist in a group called the Debonaires that was around. Davidson also encountered, quote, the world's oldest and richest groupie at the Palm Garden, the Blatt's Palm Garden, a Mrs. Robinson who sent the trumpeter and his new wife to New York shortly after meeting him with enough money to buy a house in New Jersey. Now that's a groupie. I can tell you when I was traveling, we never met one like that. And again, I wanted to play some of Bill Davidson. He, in the 70s and 80s, he often played with a great clarinetist who lived in Milwaukee for years named Chuck Hedges, who was a lot younger and lived into the 2000s. And Chuck was a phenomenal player. And you could have heard him on a different night. Now, I had one great night in 2000, when was that? 10, I think. And I met Joe Aaron, who's the guy sitting with the clarinet, and Sammy Armado, who's the guy standing with the clarinet. And in fact, this was at sort of a concert, but it was in a club given after Chuck Hedges died, and these guys were, all his friends came together. And what do you do when a musician dies? You play. And so they were playing, but I had met them before this, and I interviewed them both on the same day in 2010. They were both in their 90s then, and that was before this picture. And they were both still playing, obviously. What can I tell you real quick about them? Well, Sammy spent much of his youth playing in clubs, including country clubs. There was a big circuit for bands in the country clubs. How jazzy? I don't know, but some of what they were playing was jazz, and there were jazz players in those bands. He eventually ended up at WTMJ playing in the bands. They had a band that played for every show, right, on the radio. And there were different bands for different shows, but Sammy played like in every band. And once they no longer had bands for the shows, Sammy ended up being the guy who scheduled all the music for their shows. And Joe Aaron, he also made his first living kind of, and I have a quote that is good, but I won't read it. You'll have to get the book because it's kind of long. But in the 30s, when he was a young man, he was playing at many of the theaters in Milwaukee, too. And I will tell you this, he made $90 a week, and that was real money back then. And he said that $3 came off for Social Security and withholding, and then that $90 check, he'd take $5 and he'd give his mom the rest of the check, and he basically kept the whole family afloat during that time. And he ended up teaching school. He started teaching music, but then he ended up being a social studies teacher for years and years in Milwaukee at Juneau High School. But he played, whenever they needed a saxophonist with the Milwaukee Symphony, say, for certain classical pieces, they always hired Joe, and he trained the best of the saxophonists in Milwaukee of my generation. I just turned 70, so that'll give you some idea about that. Just quickly, a big thing that happened in Milwaukee also was when the Wisconsin Conservatory had a jazz program founded in the late 60s, early 70s, and it exploded right away. It was led partly by T. Ellis, who was the man standing on the far left. And these were all his students there. And these students, they formed this combo, and they would go to the competitions that had started happening then, jazz contests for college groups. And as T. put it, we wiped them out every place. And they did. And all of these guys went on to significant musical careers. Especially Brian Lynch, the trumpeter who's right next to T, has been one of the very top trumpet players in New York for decades now. Sam Belton, the drummer sitting in front, he became a missionary, a minister. He played in bands, he played in clubs, and now he runs a series of coffee houses, a bunch of coffee houses in Milwaukee. Charles Small, Marcus Robinson, all these guys have done extremely well in the music business. So this was early, mid-1970s. Mantee, who's 88 or 9 now, he became one of the busiest players in Milwaukee and for years played and is still playing. And next to him playing saxophone is Berkeley Fudge, a great name. And Berkeley was the top saxophonist in Milwaukee for years and years. He had a stroke a few years ago, so he hasn't been playing. And Jessie Hawk was a great singer, but she died young in a car accident. But that was a different thing. And the music that those groups played was what we call mainstream jazz. You could see that obviously there were a lot of African Americans in that program, and it was the music that sort of followed, if you want to follow the history that people say, this is the way it went. Wynton Marsalis would say this is the way it went. Came from Louis Armstrong, went to the swing era, then went to Charlie Parker and bebop, and then went to this. And so that's the kind of music that those bands played, and that most of those players became known for playing. Here's another place, though, that jazz came from, and you probably have heard this in the last couple of weeks, and that is it came out of the church. There was that influence as well. And this was actually a gospel group from Racine in the late 70s, and the guy I was writing about was the tall young guy who was still in high school then in the back row with the white tux on. Gerald Cannon was his name, and is his name. And he came up playing in his dad's gospel group, and they used to go from church to church all around southeast Wisconsin, playing for services and for special concerts and so forth. Gerald went to UW La Crosse with the idea that he was supposed to play football, but then he decided, I like bass a lot better than football. So he wasn't at La Crosse for long, and he went back to Milwaukee and just dug into the scene, went to the Conservatory, played with people associated to the Conservatory, went to New York. Like many people who go to New York to play, first time in New York was a little too much. There are too darn many really great players there, so he came back to Milwaukee. Plus, Gerald is the first to say he needed to overcome some substance abuse issues at that time and family issues. But then he got his act straightened out. He stayed in Milwaukee for a while, and when he went to New York next, he was ready. And he has played, he has been the regular bass player in the bands of 3 great Hall of Fame jazz artists, the pianist McCoy Tyner, the drummer Elvin Jones, and the trumpeter, sure, I'll tell you later. Anyway, so Gerald is still around in New York, and he comes back to Milwaukee every once in a while and plays. But he started out in the church thing. And here's Joe Sanders, who is a generation plus younger. Joe's in his mid-30s now. And he came up in Milwaukee. He lived in the inner city. But there was a program that was sponsored by the Milwaukee Symphony that inner city kids could get free lessons from symphony players. And so there was this guy who worked at WTMJ who picked up Joe Sanders every Saturday and took him to his string bass lesson with Catherine McGinn, who was a classical string bass player with the symphony. And Joe really learned how to play. He knew how to play before that, but he really learned how to play the instrument with Catherine. And he was in this phenomenal program that was started by a good buddy of mine, Cliff Gribble, at the Milwaukee High School of the Arts. And they had a great, great program for kids. And, you could opt into this school if you could get in. And Joe played with these great combos there. First time I heard Joe play was when he was in high school, and I was judging over at the Jazz Festival at Stevens Point. And the whole band was just like, oh my God, and him among them. And he's gone on to a great career, and you can pick up record after record that has Joe on it. And I was going to play some music of his, along with a really wonderful trumpet player about his age, Philip Dietrich, who grew up in the northern suburbs of Milwaukee, a white guy. And Philip, I saw him in middle school because his high school band director had me come in to play with to work with the band. And he and Joe have done a number of things together. And Philip is now on the faculty at one of the biggest jazz schools in the country at University of North Texas. Sorry about no music. I don't know if some of you may know who we've got here. This is John Harmon playing piano, and Janet Planet singing. You know, her name isn't really Planet. Her real name's Janet Heimerman, but she's been Janet Planet for decades now. And I came up with John Harmon. I went to Lawrence University, and John came back from New York a few years before I was there to Wisconsin. He grew up in Oshkosh. And then he took over the jazz program at Lawrence while I was there. And he was a massive influence on me and many others. And the year after I finished at Lawrence, John and 6 or 7, it depends on how you count, of his former students, we started a band, and we toured the country for 5.5 years, from 1974 to 1980. And after that happened, some of us, it was like, okay, that's enough. But you know, everybody kept playing, and John, who's now 2022, he's 86, is still playing, if you'll excuse me, his butt off. He just plays great. And if you ever want a night out, you can go on Friday nights to the Manila restaurant in Oshkosh. He plays every Friday night. And he plays lots of other places too. And he and Janet have done a duo thing for a long time. But Janet has sung in very many different arrangements. And you've got to read about her in the book too. It's a fascinating story. And she didn't come up as a jazzer at all either. Her mother worked at a bowling alley, and every month she'd come back home with the 45s that they took out of the jukebox to put the new ones in, and so she listened to all these tunes, none of which was jazz, of course, and she wanted to be that singer with the long blonde hair, and hers is a fascinating story. Some of you, I hope, know Matt Bookman on the left there. And Matt's in the book along with Marty Robinson, who they were not exactly the same year, but close. Marty grew up in Neenah, and Matt grew up in Appleton. And they went to Lawrence at the same time. Like I say, I think there was a year difference, but they've been friends for years and years. And I know Matt had something to do with program here, and his daughter did another thing, right? I haven't heard his daughter, but I've played with Matt a bunch of times, including just 6 weeks ago, I think. And he's a wonderful player, great advocate for jazz, a great jazz educator. And I told him I was going to talk about him because here we are in Wapaka, and we need to acknowledge Matt Bookman. Seems like I was going to, he wrote to me last week, and the subject line in the email was, darn. What? He said, I'm sorry I can't come to your talk because our combos are giving their end of the semester concert tonight. So he's over at UW Stevens Point with his combos. I said, yeah, that's a likely story. But you know about Matt. And so that's another kind of person that's in this book. Oh, I wish I could play this music for you too, but I wish I could have played all the music for you. So this is a guy named Lyle Mays. Lyle was a little bit younger than I am. He died 2 years ago. And Lyle became one of the most often heard jazz musicians in the business in the late 70s and was for the next 25 years. He played with the guitarist Pat Metheny. And Pat Metheny was one of the most famous, and still is, one of the most famous jazz musicians ever. Lyle co-wrote with Pat Metheny 85% of the music that they did for 25 years. But he was in the background, you know. He wasn't in the background on stage because he was playing usually 4 or 5 different keyboards, often 2 at a time. He had huge hair during most of those years. Lyle grew up in Wasaki, the big town of Wasaki. There was no jazz happening in Wasaki. I can assure you of that. And Lyle was the first to say so. But he took piano lessons. And the kind of thing you can read, too, and this happens several times, is somebody like this. Yeah, I did okay in lessons until my teacher found out I wasn't actually reading the music. I would say at the lesson, could you play that for me? And I'd come back, and he would just learn it like that. He would hear it once, and he knew it. And he'd come back the next week and play it perfectly, but he wasn't reading the music. But he finally heard some jazz. His band director at Wasaki High School, whose name I can't remember, took him to some concert. He was just blown away. So he ended up going to summer camp at Shell Lake over in northwest Wisconsin, where they've had jazz camps since the 70s at least. And so 1 week a year, Lyle got to do jazz. But he was such a phenomenal talent. I first heard him when he was in college, and he was a scrawny little guy, and he looked like, you know, he was in middle school. And there he was playing, you know, while people are setting up, he's playing. What the heck is that? And he eventually dropped out of Eau Claire because he needed to go somewhere bigger. And where he went at that time was what they called North Texas State back then, which was at that time the biggest jazz school in the country. He went in there, and by his second year there, they did an album there every year. They had like several hundred jazz students, top jazz students from all over the country. By the second year Lyle was there, all the music on the album was his. He wrote everything. And then he and Pat Metheny met each other at a jazz festival. And it was like, we ought to do this. And they didn't right away. Woody Herman picked up Lyle Mays for a while. But Lyle said, I don't want to be a big band pianist. So after 6 or 8 months, he left. And he and Pat eventually did start this band. It was a tremendous success. And an odd thing, and the reason I brought him in tonight is because I don't know if any of you, I hardly look at it anymore, but I do a little bit, the Grammy Awards. 2, 3 weeks ago, whenever that was, Lyle Mays, who died 2 years ago, he won the Grammy for best, I don't know what they call it now, large group composition or something like that. A piece that he wrote shortly before he died, got it recorded before he died, and it wasn't on an album or anything. It was this one 15-minute piece, and they submitted to the Grammys, and it won. And I wish I could play this because you'd go, is that jazz? But that's where jazz has gone, you know. And say what you will about the roots, and the roots obviously are very important, but jazz is way more complicated in terms of what it is and where it's been and where it's gone than what a lot of people like to say. And, you know, you always want the simple story. Okay, well, it started in New Orleans, and it came up the river to Chicago, and then all the musicians did, and they did this. And Louis Armstrong was there. He was from New Orleans, of course. And then it went to New York, and then it was this, and then it was that. like I said, it became the swing era, it became bebop, it became this and that. But I don't even know what to call jazz and what not to call jazz anymore. And if I played this piece for you, I don't know if any of you here would say it was a jazz piece. Somebody might. I would. But it's what's happened with jazz. And where are the roots? Well, they're in Lyle's piano lessons in Wasaki. And they're here and they're there. And this music, a lot of it sounds like sort of classical music from Europe, but modern classical music. And I don't mean the kind you can't stand to listen to, but I mean just really beautiful, forward-looking music. Okay, I'll wind down pretty quick. Now, I do want to talk about what I've been working on since I retired 3 years ago. And it's a biography of arguably Ripon College's most famous graduate. And he is the young guy at age 10 on the right of that picture. And his name is Al Jarreau. And Al Jarreau grew up in Milwaukee. And his father, on the left, was a Seventh-day Adventist minister. Once kids 5 and 6 came along, who were not really planned on, how that happens, they just show up after the other kids were a little older, he could no longer support his family by being the minister at the Sharon Seventh-day Adventist church. So he got a factory job during World War II. But here's the family just before they did a family concert. And they all sang. Except Mom, who's next to Dad on the left there. She played for everybody. Played piano and played organ. And she played at church all the time. The dad, after he left the church, there was some unhappiness about that. And so he never went back. But he made sure the kids went. And she was there every week playing. And they all sang. And then they started doing these kind of family concerts. And they would sing all manner of things. A lot of religious songs, but popular songs too. And the father became famous in Milwaukee and elsewhere for playing the musical saw. You're going to have to go look it up and Google it and then listen to the sound. But he played musical saw, but he also sang beautifully, as did all the brothers. And the sisters maybe weren't quite the singers that the boys were, but they could sing too. And Al, more than anybody, he could really sing. Al Jarreau died in early 2017. And basically his body just wore out. He was 76. Yeah, right, he had already had his birthday. But he had been touring for a long, long time. He went to Ripon College. He was a psych major. The only music he did was with a quartet of singers that they did their own thing. He was never in the music department. Then he was already working clubs in Milwaukee at that time, though, and then he went to graduate school at the University of Iowa, where he got a master's in rehabilitative counseling. And he went to San Francisco, and he was a family counselor for the state of California for a number of years. Then he was working nights singing, the singing psychologist. But after a while, he was singing too much, and he quit his day job. And he had an interesting career for a number of years, but he never had a record contract till he was 35 years old. There have been a lot of times in the last 50, 60 years where if you were 35 years old, no one would ever give you a first record contract. We're too darn old. They give it to a 16-year-old with maybe this much talent, but looked cool or whatever. Al, who was a massive talent, finally got a contract at 35, and then he sang for the rest of his life. And this book is, a lot of people know this, and a lot of people don't because they just don't want to know. But Al Jarreau was the first person to win a Grammy in jazz, in pop and in R&B. And he won several in each of those categories. And for that reason, excuse my language and for putting it this way, but to jazzers, he became sort of a bastard son. It's like, he's not a jazz singer. He could sing jazz with anybody, but he just chose to do other things, too. He didn't want to be just a jazz singer. He wanted to be a pop singer. He wanted to be an R&B singer, and he was awful darn good at all of them. So maybe the sound's going to work for this, huh? You want to give it now? If this works, which it did earlier, I want you to hear what he does at the beginning here, because he starts to tell a story before he sings. And that's another thing. I mean, jazz isn't just singing songs or playing songs. We'll see what happens. But he tells a story, and then he eventually sings.
And then Letter Perfect from our first album. We'd like to do do something different for you now. This is sometimes if the words and music get a little bit, words and music get a little bit mixed together, and you don't know quite what to say. Except that I want to talk about is I used to visit this girl who lived not too far from me in Milwaukee. I was working in the breweries. And I go and every morning I would walk by her house, and she'd be sitting on the front, sitting out on the sitting on sewing. One morning I said, "Hey, I like to want to talk to you. Can you come just a little bit? Come here. I want to whisper this. Because her mother was standing over there. Whisper, say, listen, listen, say, can you count on would you take a little bit of time? I wanted to think, could you take a little bit of time, baby? Could you take a little bit, just a little bit, wee little bit? Could you take a little bit of time? Take it like a 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. Now won't you stop and take a little time out with me? Well, just take 5. You stop your busy day and take the time out to see that I'm alive. Although I'm going out on my way just so I can pay by each day. Not a single word do we say. It's a pantomime out of time, still I know our lies out for me. Half a tingles down to my feet when your smile goes much too discreet to set me on my way. Now wouldn't it be better not to be so polite? Well, you look good all for a light. You start a little conversation now, it's alright when you take it 5. Yeah. The bound, no mama no down. The bound, won't come take a little time out with me. Baby, take 5. Stop your busy day and take the time out to see that I'm alive. Although I'm going out on my way just so I can get by today, not a single word do we say. It's a pantomime and out of time, still I know my life's on for me. Half a tingle start to my feet when your smile went too discreet, it's simply gone away. Now wouldn't it be better not to be so polite? For you to good off, you're all right. You start a little conversation now, it's alright when you're taking fine. Yeah! Time out to me, your mama take 5. You stop your busy day and take the time out to see that I'm alive. Oh, I'm going out on my way so I can get by every day. Not a single word do we say. It's a pantomime and not a time. Still I know my life's out for me. Half the tingles down to my feet. When you're smiling with 2 discreet, it says we come away. Well, baby, just don't say I want it, please do not stand. You could all put your hand, hugging and a tugging, it could be oh so grand. We'll just take 5. Baby, take 5. Come on, take 5. Whisper to the girl. I keep on whispering to the girl. Now listen to the things that I whisper to the girl. Listen to the things that I whisper to her. 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 Whisper to her. With the second movie thing. Would you take a little time, mama? I ask her, ooh, sweet thing. Could you take a little bit of time, baby? Could you take a little bit of time, mama? We can fool around, we can jump down, fool around, get around, we can get around. Who got the baby? Don't if you like to, and if you like to, we can get anything.